Speaker. I appreciate the opportunity to participate in the debate. First thing I want to say on my feet, Mr. Speaker, is like all members, I learned just before coming into the House that Premier Williams of Newfoundland has announced his retirement as the Premier of that province. And since the Premier and I were both chosen to go to Oxford University on the same day at the same time from different provinces, I've always felt a very special kinship with him. And I want to offer him the sincerest thanks of the Liberal Party of Canada and of Canadians everywhere for his service, and if I may say so, for the indomitable spirit and energy with which he has led the province of Newfoundland. Speaker, in 1938, I want to assure the members, we'll get to the present very quickly. The most popular politician in the Western world was Neville Chamberlain. Neville Chamberlain was the man who, after the Munich Agreement, told the British public on a famous broadcast that there was absolutely no reason for people to go to war because of a dispute between two or three ethnic groups that were fighting in a country that was very far away, of which we know almost nothing. I think I'm almost quoting verbatim his words. 17 months later, Mr. Speaker, the Second World War broke out, at that point, Mr. Chamberlain was no longer the most popular politician in the Western world, because while he had told people what he thought they wanted to hear in 1938, very quickly events overtook him, and events overtook the world. And I want to suggest to people that it's important for us to recall and reflect on that period of time as we try to understand the circumstances in which we find ourselves today. Let me make it very clear, Mr. Speaker, that as the Foreign Affairs critic for the Liberal Party, together with other members of Parliament, I've had an opportunity to visit Afghanistan on a number of occasions, both before I was an MP and after being elected to Parliament. I've had chances to visit the region in Pakistan and in India, had a lot of conversations with people about the challenges in the region. I don't claim to have any monopoly of expertise or any monopoly of information. I'm in the opposition. I don't have access to a lot of information that the government has, but I do have certain instincts with respect to that situation, which have always, I hope, been fueled by information. And I appreciated the comments made by both the minister and both ministers today, because I think they've added a little bit to the information that we have. Nous sommes ici maintenant aujourd'hui, Monsieur le Président, pour discuter une motion, une résolution de la part de nos amis du Bloc. Et le Bloc québécois, avec l'appui du nouveau Parti démocratique, ils sont en train de dire que, écoutez, le Premier ministre a dit souvent qu'il n'y aurait pas de troupes en Afghanistan après 2011. Et il faut citer des exemples de ces discours, il a dit quelque chose comme ça. Ils disent que le général Hillier a dit quoi il a dit.
The fact that General Hillier said 2 or 3 years ago that it was impossible to have military training without combat. I can't remember the exact date given by the member for Saint-Jean, but I think that's what he said. And therefore, that the decision of the government of Canada to accept a non-combat role after 2011 with the presence of hundreds of troops, Canadian military personnel that would provide training, that all this means that we lack democracy and that this is a dishonest approach, that we are saying things to the public that are not true. I can honestly say to the member for Saint-Jean, whom I know very well, we have worked together very well on 2 committees, and we will continue to do so, that I do not share his point of view. The reason is that I have a strong feeling that Canada has important obligations at the UN and with our NATO allies. I have often said here in the House, and it is too bad that I have said that it is unfortunate that other NATO allies have not upheld their responsibilities the way they should. Our resolution in 2008 said clearly that we would be leaving the combat mission in Kandahar after 2011. Naturally, our NATO allies will say, and they always tend to say, well, then what are you going to be doing to continue to assist Afghanistan? We need this, we need that. So was there pressure from NATO? I'm not sure if we can call this pressure, but there is no doubt that NATO members, including the United States, have been saying, what are you going to be doing? You need to respect the will of the House of Commons and the other political parties, but what are you prepared to do?
If anyone says, well, what exactly went on, I can only say it's very clear what went on. A number of people, including this member and a number of other people, said to the government, you should not exclude the possibility of a training mission if that, in fact, fits in with the strategy which NATO and the United Nations are trying to establish in order to achieve the objective which is very clearly set out and repeated again in the Lisbon Statement this last weekend, and that is that we move from a position where it is NATO and other countries that are carrying the military load in Afghanistan to a point where it's the government of Afghanistan that takes on an ever-increasing degree of responsibility for the safety and security of its people. That is the objective which this House should share. We should share the idea that the only long-term prospect is to make Afghanistan more capable of providing for the security of its country, more capable of providing for the stability of its country, to a point where, in fact, all foreign troops can leave and all of us can get out and come home. The question is, how do we do that in a way as an alliance that's effective, and how do we do it in a way that respects the profound will of this House that our troops not be asked to engage in further combat post-2011? And I happen to think that what has been proposed is not perfect, and I have questions about it, and I have some issues about it that I want to discuss, but I have to say, for my part, it is not a credible position for the government of Canada to take, to say that after 10 years, we are not going to allow a single military personnel to stay behind in Afghanistan to do the job that still clearly has to be done, because we recognize that it has to be done. What kind of a reliable or sensible or thoughtful partner of NATO or indeed of the United Nations would we be if we said, no, we can't conceivably think of even doing that? There's a training need. The Minister has described it. The Minister of National Defense has described it. Everybody knows it. There are lots of opportunities and ways in which we can help to train, in which we can help to educate. Now, is that the only thing we need to do? Not at all. I continue to say to the government, and I will continue to do so, that Canada has to be as clear a diplomatic and political partner in the reconstruction of Afghanistan, in the reconciliation with Pakistan, in the internal reconciliation that needs to take place in Afghanistan and in Pakistan, as we have been a strong military player in the fighting in Afghanistan. As the Prime Minister himself has said, and many, many others have said, Mr. Speaker, there is no military solution. As the Secretary General of the United Nations said in his press conference last week, he said there is no exclusively military solution to the conflict in Afghanistan. It requires far more than that. I happen to believe it requires more on the political side, on the diplomatic side, than this government has yet been prepared to do. And just to clarify, Mr. Speaker, because this rumor keeps spreading around the Internet, and even today it was spreading around the Internet, let me make it clear. This is not a job application on my part in any way, shape, or form. I have not been offered work, nor would I accept work from this government. I'm not interested in doing it. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about, Mr. Speaker, and I want to be very, very clear about it, I'm talking about putting the best of our diplomatic skills at work for Canada in making sure that we are as an effective a force for peace and reconciliation in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, and between those two countries as we have been on the battlefield. and as we have been in the field of development. Mr. Speaker, Afghanistan is one of the poorest countries in the whole world. It's a country that has been through 30 years of civil war. It's a country whose infrastructure has been destroyed. It's a country where whole generations have never been to school, have never received any education. It's a country that is deeply poor. It's a country that has a narco-economy, of which we're all familiar, where the narcotics economy is equal to at least half of the total GDP of the country. It's a country that is a dangerous place, and it's a violent place. And I heard very clearly with my colleague from Saint-Jean say, you know, he's been to the funerals, and frankly, Mr. Speaker, we have all been, and it's tragic, and it's terrible, and it's horrendous to see it, and it's horrendous to see not only the loss of life, but the loss of limb and the deep trauma that comes with battle and with fighting. But, Mr. Speaker, one thing we have to understand about the world we're in today, Afghanistan is not the only place we face conflicts, or we are going to face conflicts. And I don't say this as somebody who relishes conflict. I don't say this as someone who in the slightest bit celebrates war, or thinks that somehow war is a cleansing or great experience for countries to go through. And there have been many politicians over generations who have had such strange ideas, but I'm not one of those people, Mr. Speaker. But we do have to understand that in this kind of violent world in which we are, where there are corners of extremism that have been allowed to fester, where you have states that are not able to effectively control their jurisdictions, and where the world is getting smaller, where people can get on planes and can move, and where ideas can move across the internet, hateful ideas that continue to advocate the genocide of a people, ideas that continue to advocate the genocide and the elimination of an entire state, the state of Israel. These are the events, these are the times, this is the moment in which we are living, and it is a dangerous and risky peace. And the member from Saint-Jean talks about les missions de paix.
Peacekeeping missions.
A mission de paix.
Where do you know of peacekeeping missions where there is no conflict? There is no peace to keep in Somalia right now, or in Congo. There is a war where 6 million people have been killed, and that's the reality. And this is a good question for Canadians to answer. It's not easy, because we know people come to me and say, Bob, that's enough. Our troops have been there long enough, and it's time to bring them home. It's time to stop the mission. I'm an elected official. I know how the population feels. But my problem is that I see a world where Canada has no choice but to engage, to eliminate the sources of violence on the planet, to eliminate the potential for worse consequences than what already exists.
People who says that we were simply there in Afghanistan to kill the bad guys. I'm not one of those who thinks that there was ever a military solution. I find it ironic that for the longest time I was described as un-Canadian by some members opposite because I advocated very strongly for the need for us to be engaged in the process of trying to create a basis for peace and the resolution of conflict alongside with the military presence. And now that I'm saying we've still got a job to do to train, as well as do the peace and reconciliation, as well as do the development, all of a sudden now people say, oh, the Liberals are suddenly going along with the Conservatives. Well, Mr. Speaker, that's not how I see things. I must confess that's not how I see it. I see it as a duty of a member of Parliament from time to speak his mind to his colleagues and to members opposite, and to try to understand the fact that when we look at how we are going to deal with the situation involving not only the security of Afghanistan, but the safety and security of Canadians and the safety and security of people all over the world, we have an obligation not simply to see this as a matter of partisan interest, but we have an obligation to see this as a question of national interest. And there have been many commentators from the left and from the right over the last 10 days who said, you know, the Liberal Party has made a colossal political mistake because we've allowed a tactical advantage to members from other parties to come along our side and to take all those of our supporters who perhaps have concerns about what's been going on in Afghanistan and who would like things to change more quickly. And I want to simply say to those people and to all those reporters who've made those comments and to all those who still harbor those thoughts, this is not about partisan advantage. You don't start talking about Afghanistan by saying, I want to do a tranche count of the electorate, and I want to see how I can cut up the electorate so I can appeal to this portion over that portion. That's not how I saw World War II. That's not how I've seen Korea. That's not how I've seen any conflict in which we're engaged as a country. And I've had issues with the government trying to suggest from time to time that because we are concerned about the way in which things have happened or things have been conducted or things that have not been done, that somehow we're unpatriotic in expressing those concerns. But just as I don't accept that criticism, I don't accept for a moment the notion that somehow this is a great issue on which to divide the Canadian people and on which for us to try to say how can we reap partisan advantage from the challenge that we face. The combat mission is coming to an end. Let's get a grip here. We're not talking about a combat mission. We're talking about Canadians withdrawing from fighting. And don't think for a moment that all of our NATO allies are thrilled with that proposition, because they're not. We then said, okay, we will participate in training. We'll participate in colleges and staff colleges and building up the capacity. Yes, we need to do more on the aid side. And I say to my colleague from Ottawa Centre, am I satisfied with the aid package coming forward from this government? No, I'm not. Do I think it's generous enough? No, I'm not. Do I see huge health care needs and huge education needs and huge needs to deal with the governance crisis? And do I think what the government has put forward is adequate? No, I don't. But that is not a basis upon which I am prepared to say that I don't support having a number of troops left behind in Kabul in order to do the training that's required under the conditions that have clearly been set out and established by the parliamentary resolution, which, if I may say so, this party had a hand in crafting. And why wouldn't we have a hand in crafting it? This mission goes beyond partisanship, Mr. Speaker. I was with my colleagues from the Conservative Party and from the Bloc and with the New Democratic Party, my good friend from St. John's East. And we were together. We saw together what we saw in Afghanistan in June. We saw the way in which Canadian troops worked. We saw the way in which Canadian civilians worked. We saw the way in which the Afghan army responded. We were all at the same meetings. We received the same briefings. None of us could have come away from that experience and said, oh, it looks to me like it's all going to be wrapped up in 2011. What did we hear? What was the expression we heard about the Taliban? You've got the watches. We've got the time. Mr. Speaker, the terrorists don't have a timetable. The terrorists don't have resolutions that say this is what has to happen and this is the day you have to do this and you have to do that. The terrorists have a different objective. And if we don't understand that as a House, and if Canadians have to come to terms with the need for this continuing engagement, with the need for us to stay involved and stay engaged, not at the expense of our own people, not at the expense of our democratic traditions, not at the expense of how we do business as a country, but as partners. And I will always remember the Afghan colonel who said to us in the meeting that we had, Canadians are different. You're not imperialists. You're not here as occupiers. You're here as partners. Our role in partnership is changing. It should change. It's time for it to change. I was a strong advocate for that change, publicly and privately, and I'm frankly proud that I was able to do so. And I continue to believe that Canada's role in partnership and in leadership in Afghanistan is ultimately going to do us far better as a country than any of the alternatives that have been proposed by some of my colleagues in the House. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments?
Minister of National Defence.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to congratulate my friend for a very eloquent and insightful speech on the history of not just the mission, but in fact the history of numerous conflicts in which, as he so rightly put it, partnerships indeed trumped partisanship. And I want to very sincerely give my friend the opportunity to perhaps, in that same spirit, expand on his references to how Canada can continue to build greater capacity on the diplomatic side, on some of the ongoing development and reconstruction that we have undertaken, knowing full well that this is very much about creating the conditions, enabling all of those important things to happen under the umbrella of security. And so while, yes, training will continue to play a central role in keeping that fragile status of stability, how does he propose that we, as a government, as a country, as a very engaged public service, civilian and military, continue to create that atmosphere? Given the very complex nature, the tribal nature, the dangerous neighborhood which Afghanistan is, how does he, in a concrete way, propose that we make greater effort in the area of diplomacy and capacity building for the Afghanistan government, which faces huge challenges, honestly, of corruption, of inadequacy in many departments, but what would he propose in a concrete way that the government do in that vein?
The honourable member for Toronto Centre.
I must confess, it's the first time a member of the government has ever asked me that question, so I'm somewhat taken aback, but I'll try to answer it. The first thing I would do, in terms of the machinery government at home, is I would not have 3 or 4 different task forces on Afghanistan and Pakistan. I'd have one. I'd insist that CETA and Department of Defense, DFATE, and PCO all work together, bring their work together into one major task force. I'd have that task force headed up by a senior ambassador. I'd make that ambassador responsible for the task force. I'd make that ambassador responsible for coordinating our work in Afghanistan and in Pakistan. And although I know that there may be some others' noses out of joint as a result of that, I think it's important that it be done. We've got to have a maximum political and aid and, frankly, military presence that matches that same work that's being done by our NATO allies. And we can't lose ground because we've stopped doing the combat. We've got to make sure that our presence is still assured there. I'm sure the minister will share my perspective that I think the key political problem is that you're not going to find a solution in Afghanistan until we do far more to reconcile issues between Pakistan and Afghanistan. I haven't had a single meeting in Afghanistan or Pakistan where the other party wasn't essentially held responsible for much of the underlying difficulties in the conflict. So I think we have to come to terms with that far more than we have. And I think we've got to be very careful that in changing the presence in Kandahar the way we are doing, which I think is right in terms of where we need to focus our attention anew, is I don't think we want to lose the continuity of our aid commitment. I think there's a lot of aid projects where we've started, where we're not sure. I think we have to make sure we complete what we set out to do. And I think we've got to make sure we've got the sufficient funds to do something that continues to be significant in Afghanistan and doesn't simply get dribbled away in a lot of projects that don't end up adding up to a very substantial presence. And I certainly hope that the House Committee, although we've had our differences, that the House Committee will be able to get back and look at this question. And I think it's very important for members to continue to have access to getting into Afghanistan and to visiting the country. We've had great difficulty doing that. And I think the more often we're able to do that, the more effective our advice will be to the government as we go forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions et commentaires.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Saint Jean. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to thank my colleague for his excellent speech. Of course, there are a number of topics that we don't agree upon, but I've always had a great admiration for his intellectual abilities and the way he presents his speech in such a passionate and emotional fashion. And I also consider him a friend on the committee, and I would like to say very respectfully that sometimes we don't agree on certain things, but it's happening in a democratic forum, and I'm very happy that it's happening here. I wanted to tell him that the statement by Rick Hillier was made 2 weeks ago, just before the government came out with its position. So he finds that training without accompaniment into the theater operations is simply impossible. And this is what I would like to ask my colleague. Have all efforts been made to try to develop an action plan that would try to solve the fundamental issue in Afghanistan? Because what we were disappointed with at the Liberal Party at the time was that there was the military aspect and that more troops were sent in to try and solve the problem. But I personally find, and this is what I would like to hear him discuss, is that it gets away from Pearson's liberal philosophy, where military solutions other than military are considered, because the solution that is being proposed now is mainly military. I would like to know whether he doesn't think they're getting too far away from Pearson's blue helmet and peacekeeping philosophy.
The Honourable Member for Toronto Centre. Mr. Speaker, I think that there are many people who would like to be like Lester Pearson or Pearson's son. We won't talk about that legacy, but I'd like to say two things. First of all, I've never thought there was an exclusively military that there was an exclusively military solution. I've never thought that, but there is violence. There are terrorists, you know, I don't know what other word to use to describe Taliban who attack civilians as well as the military forces. I think it must be said that we have to respond to violence with a certain degree of force. We need the capacity to respond. I can show you what Lester Pearson had to say to reassure you that it was his point of view as well. No, is there a military solution? Was there a military solution in Korea? Lester Pearson was the architect of the UN's attitude to South Korea, which was that it was essential that the UN respond. That was Lester Pearson who said that. So I can tell you certain things about Lester Pearson. He was one of the great architects of the idea of collective security, and he wanted the UN to have the ability to respond to the aggression of other countries. Now, this was a real attack. It wasn't just a conspiracy, it was attack. It was directed by Al-Qaeda, and they have never denied responsibility for 9/11. And I think that we have to say that the Taliban government, which was responsible for giving safe haven and even support to Al-Qaeda, this is a government that can't continue to stand, and that was the meaning of the UN motion.
Comments and questions? The Honourable Member for Ottawa Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and always interesting to hear from our colleague from Toronto. I just want to get to I know there was a lot of explanation in his speech about the position they're taking as a party, and I think it's important to note that it's not a view that's shared with everyone in his party, and we witnessed that yesterday at committee when his colleague, the former leader of the party, suggested that the training wasn't, after hearing evidence, wasn't necessarily the priority. And I want him to answer the question, if he can, in light of the fact that we have NATO, we have the Pentagon, etc., saying we're going to meet the goals of training up troops to the tune of 171,500 next year, and the fact that we haven't met our goals on development to date, be it on teacher training, on the schools that we hear about all the time, and especially in an area where he is so concerned, and that is on diplomacy. We have said and stated we need to see something like an eminent persons group to get diplomacy moving. We have no money tagged for that according to the government, just words. So I'd like to hear from him how he can support this kind of position when it's going to come at such a high cost.
A much shorter answer from the member from Toronto Centre, please.
Appreciate that, Mr. Speaker. Short answer would be I don't think the argument about aid and diplomacy is over yet. I think there's lots of room for persuasion in this Parliament. There's lots of room for discussing with the government what else needs to be done and why it needs to be done. I don't. Sure, the member says, is the glass half full or half empty, or how terrible is the glass? I just take the position that I do not have a theological or political objection to having soldiers doing training and education in Afghanistan. I do not have an objection to that. I've never had an objection to it. I think it's part of our ongoing work. I don't think we should draw the line and say you can have a nurse, you can have a doctor, you can have a policeman, you can have a retired RCMP officer, but you can't have one single soldier doing human rights work in the training of the Afghan army. That is a ridiculous proposition. An equally ridiculous proposition, Mr. Speaker, is the proposition that you can have all kinds of civilian work going on in Afghanistan without having the necessary security being provided to people. That is an equal nonsense, and that's a position which I can't sustain and I can't support. So, am I happy with the amount of the aid package? No. Am I happy with all the efforts that are being done on peace and diplomacy? No. But that doesn't take away from the fact that I do think it's important for us to have the flexibility to respond to the needs of Afghanistan and, yes, to the needs of our partners in NATO.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for